General Patrick Ryder says this is being taken very seriously.
We do have stringent guidelines in place for safeguarding classified and sensitive information. This was a deliberate criminal act, a violation of those guidelines.
General Ryder says multiple agencies continue to work on how much information is out there and how to recover it. Now, the Washington Post was able to find someone described as a Teixeira friend who was often up on the text room with him, or the chat room.
It would appear as if he sort of grew angry with the fact that only one or two people were paying attention to these documents that he was pouring his heart out into. And as a sign of just anger, he just decided to post the full documents.
So a lot of questions the Pentagon will have to answer. Now, who has clearance credentials? Does it have to look deeper into character? How could a junior member of the team, 21 years old, have that kind of access to that kind of information? How can secrets wind up on video gamers' chat box? Bloomberg's Sarah Forder.
One of the big questions is to what extent is there a Russian connection here? And they are not ruling out that there may have been involvement of the Russian intelligence. They're looking at whether the information was hacked or whether the information was subsequently altered after it was shared around on the social media sites, and whether Teixeira even had a connection.
Yeah, or whether he could just be a lonely 21-year-old kid who wanted to show off his importance on social media gamers' platform. Yesterday's North Korea missile launch may have been a new type of weapon. South Korea's military believes a new type of ballistic missile, possibly solid fuel, able to travel longer distances. The South says the missile was launched on a high angle near the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, fell into waters in the EC after traveling about 620 miles. Western Australia has been hit by the strongest cyclone in more than 10 years. A key iron ore export the port had to be closed, and a gold mine 248 miles inland had to be closed. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, trying to recover from what authorities say is a 1,000-year flood. More than 20 inches of rain in a 12-hour period. Mayor Dane Tanella saying that not only are residents but emergency services have just been overwhelmed.
There were over 900 calls for service in our fire department, and 300 of which were assisted by the Broward Sheriff's Office.
The mayor says for Fort Lauderdale, it's just about sea level, and that it continued to be a trend now, the way the climate is changing. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter, and this is Bloomberg.
I'm Ryan Curtis in Hong Kong, along with Rashad Salamat in Singapore, and our guest is Catherine Kaminsky, Chief Research Strategist and Portfolio Manager at Alpha Simplex. Catherine, simple question for you. Will the earnings here be the catalyst to sell?
It's possible. I mean, I think the challenge we're seeing right now is that we're looking at two scenarios. Either the scenario that the Fed goes on pause and that central bankers step back and that looks good for equities, or we're looking at a scenario where inflation is going to sort of be enough to cause people to actually have to react. When you're talking about earnings, that could just give us the data that shows that we're seeing the disruption or the challenge of on growth that all of this tightening may have impacted.
Catherine, what about ultimately when you've got credit where it is right now, how much of a dampener is that going to be on growth itself rather than the overall impact it has on the retail investor and also, of course, the average person?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, what I think is the most frightening right now is that people are not really thinking about what's going to happen to long-term cash flows and how much credit they're going to need. I think people are kind of continually in this state where they think that things are going to go back to normal. They're focused on cuts. They're focused on things kind of a soft landing, and they're not really focused on the potential risks of the impact on cash flows that inflation has going forward.
I think you made a very good point at the beginning, but I still want to challenge it. We're talking about if the Fed is willing to tolerate higher levels of inflation, that could be good for equities. But if they stay on inflation, that could be an issue. The way I would challenge it is a pause doesn't signal that they're tolerating high levels of inflation. It may indicate that they think that the long and variable lag will eventually do the job.
That's true. I mean, I definitely agree with you, and I think the timeline is going to matter. So even a pause in the sense that they're not tightening more, it's going to depend, right? Because if inflation continues to be sticky longer, then even pausing may not be enough. I think that's the challenge, is really sort of, this is a very delicate balance between a blunt tool like monetary policy and trying to actually deal with the incredible amount of inflation that we've experienced the last year or so, and how that's actually going to reduce, and then is it going to reduce fast enough even if they pause?
Yeah, okay, but is there also, do you think, a cognizance that inflation is something which perhaps might have reared its head anyway, given that you've got huge structural changes? We're talking about deglobalization, decarbonization, also huge demographic changes in the pipeline, but actually this is becoming a structural issue rather than one which is temporary.
Certainly, and I think that's where it's going to be challenging for investors who think that there hasn't been a structural change. And if there is actually a structural change, that inflation is more persistent, then we're going to have to see things happen at the long end of the bond market. I think that's what's been that's going to be the biggest thing to watch in the next couple of months. What does that mean for long-term cash flows? Because if you're right that there's a structural change, who wants to buy, a 10-year note at 3.4? You're going to be in a very different environment than most investors are used to for the last 10, 15 years at least.
So you see a bear market for sure at the long end of the curve?
Well, I'd say that our view, in some sense, what we've seen is that we're looking for the bottom of the bond market. I would say what happened recently kind of showed a little bit of indications we might have seen the bottom of the short end of the bond market. But until we can actually see a stable yield curve and we see that there's a premium to holding debt over longer time horizons, we won't know sort of where bond markets are going to move going forward. And that is what I think is what we need to see in the next couple of months.
You're running counter to that IMF position from a couple of days ago about how rates will eventually go lower. You think that they're wrong?
I don't think they're wrong. I think that there's different time horizons, and I think they may have a very different, much more long-term view than what I'm thinking about, and that over the next year or the next 2 years, it might be necessary for longer-term debt to take into account how high inflation has been and that it might be stickier for longer. I'd say they're probably thinking 5-10 years. I'm thinking a little bit shorter than that.
Tell me how the dollar figures in your thinking.
So the dollar has been really interesting for the last year because it was extremely strong due to the relative positioning of the U.S. It has come off quite a bit. We've seen correlations changing. This has to do with the fact that the U.S. is moving a little bit strong and relative. Remove the Fed, there is some question longer term of the potential of it being less of a sort of a core currency, and that means that we're going to see a little more pressure on the dollar as those narratives continue to rear up.
Yeah, it's something I wanted to talk with Doug about a few moments ago because we were talking about Lula da Silva in China. And the thing is, this alternative to the dollar idea has been floated many times in the past, but it generally falls short. Is it more real now because China and its allies want to stand up to the West more, and particularly the U.S.?
Possibly. I mean, and I also think just the deglobalization narrative and just the changes we've seen in terms of alliances in the last 2 years, or at least year and a half, has kind of shown a shift in the way things are traded, a shift in supply and demand relationships. And that's something that is going to change the dynamic of the dollar as a reserve currency. It won't happen overnight, but it definitely is some real indications that you could see some pressure on the dollar long term.
Second, if you see dollar weakness in, let's say, the medium term, how does that affect, where you put your money?
Well, I'd say weak dollar has some interesting implications. It definitely makes the U.S. look attractive in some ways. We're also seeing commodities have moved quite a bit as well. And that's sort of, given the fact that most commodities are priced in dollars, you're definitely seeing that having an impact on commodity prices. I think what we're also watching is energy prices have moved significantly recently, even though the CPI was looking better. And inflation measures are looking better, you might, with a weaker dollar, start to see a little bit more of things that are sort of a a tailwind for us getting into a better place with inflation as well.
You know, the dollar has trended lower for about the past 9 months. It's down from 114 on the dollar index. We generally quote the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, but it's basically the same. Where do you think for the dollar index, since that's the one that many people use, what is fair value for the dollar?
I mean, I think that's a good question. It has moved quite a bit already, but you have to remember it extended also quite a bit as well. The one thing that we have noticed is that the statistical relationships between the dollar and some of the other asset classes have changed. Last year, you saw a really strong correlation between yields and the dollar. And so as you see that dynamic of rising rates fade and the relative position of the U.S. Fade a little bit, you're kind of seeing clear pressure on the U.S. dollar. But that also has ramifications for commodities, like I discussed earlier. So I'd say if you're looking at the dollar, you have to think about it might actually come back because it's gone too far.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm just looking at the massive rise from the middle of 2021 from about 90 on the dollar index up to 115. It's given back about half, so we're really at about 50%, trending here just around 100 or so. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us. Catherine Kaminsky, Chief Research Strategist and Portfolio Manager at Alpha Simplex on the markets. 21 and a half minutes past the hour. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash. 6:22 on Wall Street. I'm Doug Christner in New York. We check markets for you throughout the day here on Bloomberg. 2 data points in the U.S. today, one on jobs, the other wholesale inflation. Both readings were slightly softer than expected, and that brought forward a little bit of hope that maybe we're near the end of Fed tightening. The market right now is still expecting a 25 basis point rate hike at the May meeting. However, bets are increasing that the Fed will be forced to cut rates at the end of the year at a rate faster than the market had been anticipating earlier. Yields today across the curve moving up just a little bit, more so at the long end where the 10-year was up 5 basis points to 344. At the shorter end of the curve, the 2-year was up nearly a basis point to 396. But boy, did we have a rally in the equity market. NASDAQ comp today up 2%, the Dow ahead a little more than 1%, and the S&P 500 higher today by 1.3%. We'll take another look at markets for you in about 15 minutes. Ed Baxter is next with a look at global news headlines. Eddie. All right, thank you very much, Douglas. Yesterday, North Korea missile launch may have been a new type of weapon. South Korea's military believes new type of ballistic missile, possibly using solid fuel. Japan is saying today its activation of the emergency alert system was not an accident, was carried out according to plan. Western Australia has been hit by the strongest cyclone in more than 10 years. Commodity flow affected, iron ore and gold mining. U.S. intelligence community has made an arrest in the intelligence leak case. U.S. agents arresting Airman Jack Teixeira in Massachusetts. Joining us is Bloomberg Justice Department reporter Chris Strom. Chris, thank you so much again for joining us. What do we know about the suspect?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting case because Teixeira is a low-level junior Air National Guardsman, and he gained access to this very highly classified information that is really only for senior officials to be able to see, and has implications for diplomatic relations across the world, and has created a huge embarrassment for the Biden administration. And so he was arrested today, and he'll have his initial court appearance tomorrow in Boston, at which point we expect to actually see the specific charges that the government is alleging against him.
Yeah, now, the optics of this globally and geopolitically, and I don't want to get into too much opinion here, it's not what we do, but I mean, this is explosive. It's explosive and almost laughable and funny at the same time. This is a 21-year-old gamer who has this kind of critical information. There are a lot of questions, aren't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions right now. And it also, when you look back over the last decade, some of the most significant breaches have been carried out by young professionals, young professionals in the military or associated with the intelligence community, going back to Edward Snowden, who was a contractor for the intelligence community, and then some of the other cases that have come up over the last decade. And so there's something really wrong at the level of who is getting access to classified information and how the secrets are being protected. And of course, we do live in a world where plenty of people will criticize the overclassification of information.
Now, there are a couple of reports out there today that said that he was actually it ran it up on a Bloomberg story today that he was lonely during COVID, and that the anonymous source, the Washington Post, turned up, said that he was really mad because he wasn't getting enough attention to these posts, and it was up on a gamer's site. I mean, it doesn't look like maybe he was working with Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, right?
That's right. I mean, what we know at this point is that he initially posted his these documents on a website called Discord, which is for young gamers, and he had his own gaming group, and so he would post this information for the people that were part of his group to be able to see. And then he felt that they weren't taking it serious enough, the information that he was trying to expose. And at some point, the information made it to more mainstream websites like Twitter. Now, the exact way that these documents made their way onto Twitter isn't clear yet, and that's part of the investigation. But overall, the investigators are looking at how he got access to this information and what he was doing with it, and whether anybody else was involved, and also whether foreign adversaries like Russia got access to these documents.
Yeah, I guess that's the next step. I mean, what could have been gotten, how authentic are they, were they altered? I mean, and then you have the spokesman for the Pentagon, Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, standing up in front of the media saying we take this very seriously, and they do they not?
Yeah, there's absolutely. The intelligence community and the Defense Department take classified information seriously, but there is so much classified information, and there's so many ways that classified information is viewed these days. It's not just kept inside a secure location. It's also distributed, through online networks, and multiple thousands of people are able to get access